Hello and welcome to Socialism, the Marxist podcast from the Socialist Party. Hit subscribe today to never miss an episode. If you're not yet a member of the Socialist Party and agree with the points raised today, then get in touch on our website www.socialistparty.org.uk to find out what being a member will mean for you. Our website is packed with even more political analysis, and you can subscribe to our weekly paper, The Socialist, and our monthly magazine, Socialism Today, getting them delivered to your door or an e-subscription to your email. The Socialist Party has no big business backers. We rely on support from individual donations, and if you agree that we need an alternative to capitalism, then make a donation today. Today's podcast is a discussion with Socialist Party General Secretary Hannah Sell, introducing the party's new document on British perspectives produced by the National Committee. This important document is being distributed to all members for reading and discussion ahead of the Socialist Party National Congress this March. At the Congress, the document will be debated with a vote of delegates from all the different branches around the country. There's many more points in the document that can be discussed in one podcast, and Socialist Party branches will be organising meetings to discuss and also the chance to discuss it individually too. So if you're interested in what you hear today, get in touch with your local branch to find out more, and enjoy the rest of the episode. Hi Hannah, thanks for joining me. So today we were discussing the British Perspectives document.
That's right, yes.
And what is that?
So we have our national conference coming up in March, and we begin it with a discussion on the world, actually, but then we discuss British perspectives. And the reason we do that is because for us, the starting point is always objectively what's taking place in society. You know, Marx said conditions determine consciousness. And if capitalism in Britain was about to deliver everybody lovely living standards and take serious action to solve climate change, then there will be very limited prospects for building the Socialist Party. So before we come to our practical conclusions about the work we do, we start with discussing perspectives for Britain. And we're going to talk about some of it today. But if you're a member of the Socialist Party, I would really say this is like a little taster. There's a lot more in the document, and I think we're going to have time.
Great, thanks Hannah. So my first question is, what will be the fate of the establishment parties, Labour and the Tories, in the coming period?
It's a really important question. I do think the kind of ailing I can't say the word, sclerotic character of British capitalism has resulted in a hollowing out of our main establishment parties over a long period of time. And I think we in the Socialist Party, and maybe working class people in general in Britain, we're kind of so used to it, we forget the significance of it. The Tory party was such basket cases for their last period in office that their devastating collapse almost like passes us by. But we should not forget how big what has happened actually is. This was the most successful capitalist party on the planet. In the 1950s, they had almost 3 million members. They had a trade union wing. You know, they had a serious social base. 95,000 people voted in the recent Tory leadership election. That's how much they've collapsed. And in the general election, they had their worst defeat in their existence since 1830. Different dates you can take as their beginning, but let's say 1830. So a devastating defeat for the Tory party. The most important thing for us to understand is it's not that the crisis in the Tory party has created a crisis for British capitalism. It's the other way round. In the end, it was the crisis of British capitalism that has destroyed or is destroying the Tory party, and the same is going to happen to Labour as well. As far as the Tories go, what's their future? I think it's quite difficult to say precisely what is going to happen to this broken shell of a party. Right now, the kind of more serious representatives of capitalism that are still in the Tory party are sitting on the back benches hoping things are going to get better. But it's a bit of a sign of their weakness, uselessness. They couldn't even get their candidate on the ballot paper for the ballot that went out to the Tory party membership. But I don't think they're about to walk away from the Tory party, because the more serious capitalists also understand that what's happened to the Tories will happen to Labour, that it might be governing in their interest right now, but it's going to hit real crises. So they need a second 11. So they're probably going to try and stick Humpty back together again and make something out of the Tory party. But whether they succeed, how that plays out, I wouldn't like to bet on that. I think we have to be prepared for all kinds of reconfigurations of the establishment parties under the pressure of events in the next period, like we've seen in other countries where parties of hundreds of years standing have disappeared, new parties have come into existence. But what we can say for definite is none of them are going to have a stable social base. They're going to be inherently weak, unstable parties, and that's a reflection of the crisis.
So I think it's very difficult to talk about the political situation in Britain without mentioning the elephant in the room, the recent election.
Especially today.
Exactly, today on his inauguration, Trump's election. So how will that affect Britain politically, but more importantly, how will it affect it economically?
Okay. Obviously, the election of Trump is a great big question, and we'll have other podcasts that deal with it in a general way. But I do think it matters when we're talking about British perspectives to talk about what effect it's going to have for British capitalism and for this government. And none of it's good. I think that's the short answer. Obviously, Starmer has been going on about his constructive relationship with Trump. What a lovely dinner they had together last year. And he's kind of begging for a US-UK trade deal. And that's normal. Capitalist politicians suck up to new US presidents in the hope of trying to get something because it's still the most powerful country in the world. It doesn't make it any less sickening, but it is absolutely normal behaviour for a capitalist politician. But it's not going to get them a trade deal. And fundamentally, nothing can prevent British capitalism being particularly vulnerable to what Trump represents. And it's not just about him. We've already seen that really with the bond market jitters earlier this month and the fall in sterling. British capitalism is outside of any of the major trading blocs. It's a weaker power and it's extremely reliant on foreign capital. And all of that makes it very vulnerable to what is currently taking place. We can't go in depth into the broader issues here today, but I suppose the bottom line is that the US is trying to put the rest of the world on rations. It's trying to protect its own markets, particularly against China, but actually against all other economies. And it's doing that by protectionist measures, by tariffs, but also state subsidies and other things. And that was true under Trump, Mark 1. It was true under Biden. He didn't get rid of those tariffs and he introduced a lot more state subsidies. And it's going to be true in a bigger way, again, under this second Trump presidency. One of the fundamental contradictions of capitalism that Marx described is the contradiction between the nation state and the world market. And that's always been there, but different things are dominant at different times. So in the 90s and the noughties, US imperialism was in favour of globalisation, of increasing world trade, all in its own interest. It wasn't doing it for the good of humanity, but it did increase massively in that period of time. But today, it's not in its interest anymore. So it's putting the barriers up, and where the US has led, other countries have followed. There's been a huge increase in the number of state subsidies, tariffs, and so on around the world in the last period. You could say, really, we've got a kind of multipolar world, with the US as still the strongest, but a weakening power relatively, then China, and then a whole number of other powers who are manoeuvring to try and defend their national interests in this kind of swirl of a multipolar, chaotic world situation. And Britain is very vulnerable in that situation. And that relates to the fact that Britain, let me give concrete examples of things that are going to happen, which will lead to splits in this government. They're cozying up to the EU at the moment. They want to get a better trade deal with the EU. They also want a trade deal with Trump. They're not going to be able to get a trade deal with the EU if they accept US food standards of chlorine washed chicken and all the rest of it. But vice versa, you know, they can't do both. And that's going to be true on every issue. Rachel Reeves has gone to China. They want to get Chinese electric vehicles. That will mean a threat of tariffs from Trump. On every occasion, they're going to face a choice between bad options, none of which will be good for British capitalism. And all of that is before the next global economic crisis, which is definitely coming. Capitalism is a cyclical system. At the moment, most of the advanced economies are kind of bumping along the bottom, stagnant, like Britain, barely growing. In formal terms, the US is doing better. There is actually growth in the US economy. Not how it feels for many US workers, hence the presidential election result. But the stock markets are soaring, and they're going to soar more now on the basis of Trump's victory. And he's pumping up those stock markets. All these speculative bubbles, that's what they are. Even cryptomania is, you know, buying into and pumping up. But that will burst at a certain stage and lead to a new economic crisis. And I suppose then the other thing we have to bear in mind is if you go back to the Great Recession, the 2007-2008 crisis, which British capitalism's never recovered from, that wasn't as bad as it might have been, because US imperialism did still then act to kind of coordinate a world response. Really, it acted as the world's banker. And that did lessen the effects. Contrast that to the Great Depression. The 1929 crash was not the primary, really, cause of the Great Depression. It was the response to it, where US imperialism at that point in time introduced shed loads of tariffs, 20,000 tariffs, and the rest of the world followed suit, and then you got the Great Depression. Is Trump in the White House? What response do you think we're going to get to the next world economic crisis? Actually, even Biden was on the same path and would not have done the same as in 2008, but that is definitely true about Trump. So none of it is going to be good for ailing US capitalism. And I suppose the last thing I'll just say on that is, why did Britain suffer the worst in the recent kind of bond market turmoil? Because it did suffer the worst, but it wasn't anything British capitalism had done or that Reeves had done, really. It was what was taking place in the US. It was the consequences of Trump's election. But the reason that Britain suffered the worst is because the bond markets can see how weak British capitalism is. They can see that no government, some of them maybe thought that Rachel Reeves really did have a magic wand and she would come up with some magic solution, but her budget showed she couldn't. So it's vulnerable to attack. So it might have been caused in the US, but it was Britain that suffered the most. And that's a little harbinger of what comes in the future. There's a famous kind of saying that when the US sneezes, the world catches a cold. Well, that is particularly true for British capitalism.
So why is it that Britain in particular is so vulnerable and its economy is in such a bad state, even compared to, say, suffering economies like Germany and France? Why is that?
Why are we so crap?
Yes, yeah. Exactly.
Look, there's quite a bit of explanation in the document on this, and I think branches should discuss that. And I am not going to give you loads of statistics today because we've got a limited time. But just to give you a couple, since the Great Recession, our relative decline has accelerated. So in 2023, Britain's economy was 22% smaller than it would have been if the pre-Great Depression trend had continued. Our business investment is second bottom out of the 38 OECD countries. Only Greece has a lower level of investment than Britain. And our productivity growth, not surprisingly, is less than half the OECD average. So British capitalism is just, has very low productivity growth, low levels of investment. It's a bit useless. The reasons for that are complicated, but I suppose the most basic point is it was the first capitalist power. It's the oldest, and it's the most aged and decrepit as a result of that. So I know that sounds simple, but that is a big part of the explanation. But I think that the other thing that is worth just mentioning is that at the time, maybe I'll deal with this later on actually. Yeah, I will deal with that later on. But I would just say, I'll say the other thing I'd say on this is, of course, Starmer is saying he's going to change it. That's their solution to everything. And it just ain't going to work. Before the general election, they were thinking maybe they could invest in green technology and corner part of that market. But then they discovered China's got it all already. There's no space for British capitalism. Now they're talking about AI. Britain does not have a single one of the most powerful 500 computers in the world. There is no chance of Britain being a global competitor on AI. It's true that there are some British high-tech startups. They do exist. But what happens to them? They get gobbled up by the giant US tech companies, and even the few that remain independent generally move to the US. And that's what's happening with British industry, British companies. They move to the US stock market. 88 of them, I think, did it last year alone, because there they hope for greater investor, greater profit. There's no point for them in staying with British capitalism.
So I know Labour are very unpopular at the moment, but there's many people who are hoping against hope that they will do something at least to improve workers' rights. And what do we think about that? Are they going to follow through on some of their pre-election pledges?
Well, I mean, look, we're the hardest fighters for every gain for the working class. So any law they pass, which even marginally helps working class people, we will welcome. But I think we've got to look at what they're doing and why they're doing it. Because this is a capitalist government. That's kind of obvious to us, but I think we have to restate it and also think through how it's different to the Labour governments of the pre-Tony Blair era. Because in our view, it is different. Tony Blair's government and Brown and the others, they were capitalist governments. Prior to that, we had Labour governments that did act in the interest of the capitalist class, but Labour was a capitalist workers' party. And what we mean by that is even though its leaders defended capitalism when push came to shove, nonetheless, it had a working class base as a party, and it had some democratic structures that allowed the workers' movement to express, the working class to put pressure on, to influence what the leaders did. And that is a different situation to today. So to give you an example, at last year's Labour Party conference, Unite and other unions got a motion passed over the winter fuel allowance. The year before, CWU and other unions got a motion passed for renationalisation of Royal Mail. They mean nothing. I mean, we're pleased to see them passed. It's a sign of the mood of the trade unions, but they have no effect on the tops of the Labour Party. But it wasn't always like that. So, for example, I think in 1969, the In Place of Strife, which in reality was anti-trade union legislation, white paper was drafted by Labour. The TUC got furious, called a special conference. They had to ditch it. They just got rid of it. The trade unions were able to affect what Labour did in office. That is not today. Of course, the trade unions can affect what Labour does in office. The same as we can affect what the Tories do in office by going on strike, by fighting, but not through the structures of the Labour Party. But there was another side to those historical governments. I'm belabouring this point a bit. Don't worry, I won't go on about other things for so long. Because the other side was that also made Labour a very useful second 11 for the capitalist class. Because there would be times when the Tories just couldn't get things through in the interest of the capitalist class. And Labour, as a party workers saw as theirs, was actually more able to get anti-working class legislation. Today, the majority of the capitalist class wanted this Labour government because the Tory party was falling apart. But also because they thought workers will think this is their government, and so they'll accept a new round of austerity. They won't go on strike the way they've gone on strike in the last few years. Now, of course, that ain't going to work because working class people don't see Labour as theirs in the way they did in the past. But a lot of the trade union leaders will do their best to make that come to pass. If they don't strike, hold off. Otherwise, we'll get the Tories back, or maybe even reform. This lot are better. And they had to give some crumbs to make that work. So there is some workers' rights legislation. There is a promise to, far too slowly, but to repeal some anti-trade union legislation. Even if they repeal every bit of it that they've said they're going to repeal, we'll still have the same anti-union legislation as in the Tony Blair era, which he correctly said was the most repressive anti-trade union legislation in the Western world. So let's not get carried away with what they're doing. But they're doing that in order to try and say, look, we are a party for workers, and therefore to be able to get away with carrying out attacks on the working class. And we can't fall for that. We've got to warn against that idea. It's the same with this stuff about partnership. And it's just come out publicly today, I think. The education unions, and it'll happen with other unions as well, being invited to commit to defending the common interests of the government, the education unions, and the education employers. We oppose that. We don't have common interests with employers. The job of unions is to defend the interests of their members and the broader working class. But it's that idea, look, we're with you, we're on your side, let's all be together to try and cut across struggle. Of course, if that was to work, I think they've said the workers' rights legislation is going to cost employers £5 billion a year. Frankly, that would be a bargain for the bosses if that stopped class struggle. But it's not going to work. Education, for example, the teachers and education workers are being offered, schools workers, are being offered 2.8% next year, unfunded. That means massive further cuts in education. There's no bit of paper about working together that is going to stop the pressure from below to fight against that. So none of it's going to work, but nonetheless, that is why they're doing it. It's a kind of last appeal to what Labour used to be, but being used, frankly, by the bosses in order to attack the working class.
Excellent. So you mentioned there some of the attacks that we faced so far, like the two-child benefit cap, the winter fuel payment, the WASPy women payments, and that's before they unleash massive further austerity and cut public services. And in the vacuum, or in the mass anger there, the far right and the populist right are trying to fill that political void. So how much of a threat are Reform UK, and could they win the next election even?
Next election's a very long way off. But look, you're right. This is, I mean, it's not just a British trend. It's an international trend. Look at the US, look at France. There's lots of different countries where right populist or far right, and I think it would be right to call Reform right populist, formations are stepping into the vacuum, the anger against all of the mainstream capitalist politicians, and particularly in many countries like in Britain, in the absence of genuine mass workers' parties, they're being picked up by a section of the working class as a means to express their rage against the elites. And that's happening with Reform here in Britain. I think, though, we have to not fall into the trap, which you could easily fall into as a Guardian reader, perhaps, of seeing these right populist formations. I'm not accusing you of being a Guardian reader, and there's nothing wrong with reading the Guardian critically. But these right populist formations as being solely responsible for whipping up racism and nationalism. I mean, let's be clear about this. As we were referring to earlier, capitalism is based on nation states with deep-rooted national consciousness, and the capitalist class have always been willing to whip up racism and nationalism when it suits their interests in order to do so. And it didn't help them in the general election, but the Tories were whipping up anti-migrant feeling like crazy in the run-up to the general election. And of course, Labour are continuing in basically the same way. So this is a reflection of capitalism in crisis. It's not just about Reform or Farage's kind of media presence or whatever. And I also think, well, I suppose, what other things should we say? Certainly Reform are now surging in the polls. We can all see that. And they've had a base for a while. Or rather, Farageism has had a base because he's gone under different names, hasn't he? But if you go back to the 2015 general election, UKIP got almost 4 million votes. That is only slightly less than they got in the general election this year. But the collapse of the Tory party meant that this year they got 5 MPs elected. But now, with growing hatred of Labour, clearly they can win more. They can get further electoral victories. So I think we have to be careful not to interpret that as meaning that every Reform voter is some kind of hardened racist, because that is absolutely not the case. Let's remember those UKIP voters I was just talking about, more than 1 million of them switched from UKIP to Jeremy Corbyn in 2017. And that shows primarily they were expressing their anger about what capitalism meant for them, and they could be won to a left-wing and anti-racist candidate in that election. Nor do I think we should draw the conclusion that this reflects a generalised move to the right in society or the kind of balance of forces at this point in time. And I think the summer far-right riots are a very good example of that, because obviously they were horrific. And if you were going to a mosque under threat of attack or in one of those asylum centres that was attacked, they were terrifying. So we're not underestimating them, but there were only about 15,000 people actually took part in them, whereas the counter-protests were far, far bigger. And actually, you know, Labour politicians, the Met Police were telling everybody to stay at home, don't come out and protest. But the demos were so powerful, they had to bend and say and welcome them, in inverted commas. And, you know, King Charles goes to Walthamstow to welcome their marvellous multiculturalism. That's a reflection of the establishment having to try and incorporate that movement because of its power at this point in time. So we shouldn't go too far on what the balance of forces is. But we also shouldn't underestimate the danger. There's no doubt that in general, anti-migrant feeling being whipped up gives confidence to far-right racist thugs, and that we can see more and potentially bigger outbursts like the lightning flashes we saw over the summer. And therefore, our campaign that the workers' movement has to take seriously the struggle against racism, has to be prepared to organise proper stewarding against far-right demonstrations, and critically, has to organise around class slogans. You know, jobs, homes, services for all, not racism. Rather than just condemning anyone who's voted for reform as a racist, it has to make a class appeal, and in that way can cut across it. So I think that's a kind of balance of where we're at the moment. What's going to happen in the future? I mean, I think the most important thing to say is even if Farage was to achieve his wildest dreams and to be the next Prime Minister, as you mentioned, what would that actually mean? We're a long way from that at the moment because he's doing well in opinion polls right now, but it's an extremely unstable populist party, which is already splitting. By next year's elections, we could have 5 different reforms competing against each other. So we shouldn't get too far ahead about how far this is going to go. But even if that was to happen, that would be on the basis of Labour being hated, of the Tories collapsing completely, and you would have a minority government coming to power on the basis of a deep crisis of capitalism. Would that be a powerful government capable of taking on the working class? Or would it be an extremely weak government which would face mass movements of the working class against it? And I think it's clear it will be the latter. So we have to see things, we've got to be open on how far reform go, or whether it's some new right populist project and exactly what happens, but we have to recognise the extreme weakness will be of any such formation.
So you mentioned the weakness of a potential reform government, but Starmer has also been elected on a very low turnout.
Absolutely.
And what forms of struggle were we likely to see against further austerity from his government?
I mean, so many. That's the thing. As you said, they were elected on the lowest share of the electorate of any government since 1918. So they were unpopular last July in reality, but they've got a lot more unpopular since then. And we are definitely going to see strike action. Actually, we already are. The 6 forms have been out on strike, the Birmingham bin workers. It's not like there's no strikes at the moment. But what is coming down the track, that they're delaying the public sector spending review while they fight behind the scenes. What they're fighting about is who has to carry the biggest cuts. It's going to be cuts across the board. That's the reality. But that is going to create enormous anger in the trade unions. The fact that they've already said no more than 2.8% in the pay rounds next year has meant that even the most pro-Labour unions, Unison Health, for example, their leadership have been very Labour loyalists. They've had to come out talking a good fight, saying that they're going to have to take action because it's so bad and the pressure from below is so great. And I think we also have to take into account that while the number of activists in the unions is still quite thin, really, it's a lot bigger than it was. And there was a new generation who came into action in the strike wave. So they've got the idea. If things are bad, you can do something about it, and you do something about it via collective action. That's now ingrained in a new generation of union activists, and they will exert pressure for action. So we could see a new national strike wave over the question of pay out of the next pay round. It may not work out like that, but there's certainly going to be new strikes on pay, but also on cuts. All kinds of cuts. The NHS, it's cuts in reality, whatever they say. Local authority cuts are going to be massive. And we will be fighting in every sector for the maximum possible action and working with that new layer of militant activists to achieve that. But I think it's not only going to be the question of industrial action. I mean, I mentioned there the council cuts. That affects the workforce, but it also affects the communities who are losing services. And new community campaigns on those issues are already starting to develop, particularly in Scotland and Wales, and we can see more broadly. And we fight to play a role in bringing the different disparate campaigns together and the workforces together for needs budgets against any cuts, rather than falling into, we don't want our service cut, but we don't mind if another one does, and so on, to try and get united campaigns. So I think we'll see those. But all sorts of other stuff. We have to be prepared for new riots. But as also new anti-war movements after the powerful movement on Gaza. And let's remember, I was talking about the effects of Trump earlier. British capitalism's general position is to back up whatever US imperialism does. Starmer already lost votes even before he was elected as a result of backing up US imperialism in its support for the IDF onslaught on Gaza. There's going to be new anti-war movements, and that will certainly be a feature, but also climate change, anti-racist, women's movements. I don't think we're going to have a problem of there not being battles taking place. We may have the opposite problem, that we feel drowned by the number of different struggles that develop, and not necessarily all at once, but over a period of time. I think the Perspectives document does briefly emphasise the importance of the struggle on the campuses, and that is worth just mentioning, because the university funding crisis was one of the issues on the shit list that Labour had before they came to power, drawn up by the now gone Sue Gray, and that has not gone away. A tiny hike in tuition fees will make students angry, but it's going to do nothing to stop cuts. So students are paying more at the same time as huge cuts on campus, with probably future reorganisation of student funding ahead, and we can play an important role in the movements that will take place on the campus.
So you mentioned there are a lot of different disparate movements, and I think one of our key demands is trying to bring those together and organise them into a political form in the form of a new Workers' Party. So what are the prospects for that over the next few years?
The long-standing members of the Socialist Party have been busy calling for a new Workers' Party for a very long time, and perhaps sometimes feel like we do it out of routine. But there has never been a more important time to fight for this demand than now. Honestly, it's really lodged in the objective situation. Like we've discussed previously, objectively, the possibility was there well before the general election. Think back to the strike wave. Two union leaders involved in that strike wave launching the Enough is Enough campaign. 500,000 people signed up. That dwarfs the membership of the Tory party. It dwarfs the membership of Reform. It showed the potential for a new mass workers' party. Unfortunately, those leaders saw it as leading back to Labour rather than being a new party. So as we expected, there was no new party in the general election. But still, the election of Jeremy Corbyn as an independent, and also the other four Gaza independents, that does show the potential in that general election for a new party. And yes, particularly the four other independents, not Jeremy, they were primarily elected by a section of the working class from a Muslim background who broke with Labour specifically over the question of Gaza. But honestly, 6 months in, isn't it clear that if an alternative existed, they would also be joined by other sections of the working class who are furious about what Labour is doing and we're prepared to vote for a left alternative. So the objective potential is there. Of course, that doesn't mean it's simple getting a new party. And there's lots of different things to discuss about the process of how a new party could be formed, some of the complications and so on. And we do deal with those in the Perspectives document. and also actually in last year's British Perspectives document, which is worth Socialist Party members rereading. But I think what is really important for us to emphasise is that while we relate positively to any steps towards left candidates standing in elections, new left formations and so on, we don't call for a new left party, we call for a workers' party. And the most important debates are the debates that are going to take place in the trade unions. More than 6 million workers who are organised, many of whom, not all by any means, are part of unions that are affiliated to Labour and pay money to Labour. Even under Tony Blair and New Labour Mark 1, that issue was posed. The firefighters disaffiliated. Bob Crow, as the leader of the Transport Workers Union, worked with us to found the Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition. So it came up last time. It's going to come up a whole heap more this time around. The idea that workers keep paying money to a party, paying the hand that's beating you around the face, why would you do that? So the question of disaffiliation is going to come up, but not just that, the need for a positive political alternative. Now, there'll be opposition to that. There'll be union leaders who keep saying that we've just got to back Labour or we'll get Nigel Farage. And when that doesn't work, who say, well, we better just stay out of politics. We don't want to be involved in elections. Let's just concentrate on industrial disputes. So it's not that we're not going to face opposition, but amongst ordinary trade unionists, those questions are going to be posed. And whatever their limits, the existence of the block of 5 independents and also the suspended Labour MPs who've been suspended for voting against the 2-child benefit cap being lifted and on the winter fuel allowance, that is a putative workers' bloc in Parliament. And trade unionists are going to be thinking, why aren't we funding them to set a party up instead of giving money to Labour? And I think there's one other big push factor, and that actually is reform. Because if the unions just fund Labour or step out of politics, you're leaving a vacuum. And it's clear people are going to express their anger somehow. So the need for the working class to have its own party, to offer a positive, anti-racist, socialist alternative, those debates are going to come and we've got to be at the forefront of them. Why does this matter to us? Fundamentally, it matters to us because we want to overthrow capitalism. We want to build a new socialist society, and the class that is capable of doing that is the working class. So any step towards the working class being more confident in its own collective power, in being a potential governmental alternative, is a step forward. And you can't just achieve that industrially. You need to have a political voice as well. So it's potentially a very important step forward, and that's why we fight for it. But I think we also have to be clear in the Socialist Party, we don't just want a mass workers' party. We want to overthrow capitalism. We want a new socialist order. And that means a workers' party that has drawn the necessary conclusions that you can't gradually turn capitalism into a fairer system. It's rotten and it's got to be overthrown. So for us, we fight for every step forward for the working class, including a new workers' party, including industrial militant trade unionism, but we also fight to build the Socialist Party as a party with a clear programme for the socialist transformation of society. And we are very confident on the basis of the mess that British capitalism is in, the struggles that are coming against the consequences of that, there's going to be big opportunities. Even if we weren't there, there will be more and more working class people drawing the conclusions that we've drawn, but with us there, we can speed that process up in the
Great, thanks Anna. So
no
thanks
problem
for joining me. I'll see you next time.
See you next time.
So hopefully what you've heard today has got you fired up and ready to get campaigning to build an alternative to the mainstream capitalist parties. And if you're not yet a member of the Socialist Party and agree with what you heard today, then get in touch on our website www.socialistparty.org.uk to find out what being a member will mean for you. We've got much more political analysis on our website, and you can also subscribe to our weekly paper, The Socialist, and our monthly magazine, Socialism Today. Again, the Socialist Party has no big business backers, so we rely on all our campaign funding from individual donations. And if you agree that we need an alternative to capitalism, make a donation today. So that's it from today's podcast, and hit subscribe to never miss an episode. I'll see you next time.